Well, welcome. We are interviewing today Father Joesph Kovitch of St. Matthew's Episcopal Community. Father Joesph has been in this role for quite a while, and he'll be able to talk more about that in a moment. This video is part of an ongoing study of authentic diversity at All Saints, and the topic today is ableism. So, Father Joesph, thank you. Thank you for being willing to be on camera with me and all that entails of being vulnerable and open and sharing your own story with us. I just want to begin by allowing you to tell that story of how you became a priest at St. Matthew's Episcopal in Westerville, okay. and what has been meaningful to you in this role at St. Matthew's.
Well, I'm used to being on camera, first off, for the past 18 months that we have been streaming and living into that same question that you and I think the entire church and the entire world. So your question. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church is a community born out of the necessity of having to leave a building, a very large building. So I came on board 8 years ago when, with 3 weeks left in the building. So I had 3 weeks with them in a building, and then on a Pentecost Sunday, we processed out on the front lawn, never to come back to that building.
Wow!
And so in that process, we became reformed or transformational. So in that. I've been in the chair for 14 years, so at that moment where, when the bishop comes to me and says, well, will you kind of lead them out into the wilderness? That was the interesting opportunity, and I was very open to being with a community that, in a way, found it a disabling moment, if you will say. So from that point, we turned our backs to a bricks and mortar existence and faced out into the street and into the neighborhood and said, behold your parish. So from then, we journeyed, forming our identity and our identity around kind of the church that wouldn't say die. And
did it feel like a kind of time of exile, you think, for them?
Well, that's a good word. I think language is so important, and so there were a lot of biblical imagery. So I could say, I take the mantle of Moses and we enter into the wilderness, or we journey into the community, into a diaspora where we find ourselves defined not by a place. And it was tough because I know in most churches, I'm sure yours, you have the histories of the generations and that building that place with baptisms and confirmations
and who laid the tile and who painted the walls and
absolutely
who gave money to build this or to make that.
And it was powerful. But the small band that hung on, we let out, and so we took a summer in one place, and I took the mantle of kind of probing out in the community. So I became a holy listener. My office became Java Central, coffee shop, and the members knew that somewhere along the line we will gather again on Sunday, hold together, and as we journeyed through this, our identity began to change because we began moving from a narrative kind of the culture of maybe a traditional culture to a missional culture, because all of a sudden, maybe like the movie Field of Dreams, it's like crazy to leave your building and where are you going to go? And it was the mystery of that. Then all of a sudden, like the movie, it wasn't baseball players that showed up on this baseball diamond in a cornfield. It was all of a sudden the people that we know of, the nuns and nuns, people that, so I began hearing stories. So taking on the holy listener mantle, and the congregation, at one point said, okay, Father Joe, we know now, trust has been built, you're with us, we're with you. So if we go off the cliff, you're going down with us. And that was the moment I felt like, okay, we've arrived, that we're in this together.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. Very well put. So I'd like to move on to more of the topic of ableism and disability.
Right.
And you mentioned that you've been in the wheelchair 14 years, and I'd like you to be able to talk about that with us. What happened when you lost the ability to walk fully, and yeah, we'll begin with that.
All right. Well, and even the story of St. Matthew's, everything is entwined.
Right.
I think in reality, everything relates, everything belongs. Because we are kind of an amalgamation of all our stories, all our disabilities. Because during this journey, I would say we all have a disability. I have the advantage of pointing to a chair. There are most people may not have that ability of something that holds them back or disables them. So yeah, in this journey, the St. Matthew's journey, I can point to the chair and say, being a part of a community that is vulnerable, that faces uncertainty, that experiences diminishment or loss at that moment. There's a lot of beauty in that conversation because, we end up realizing that we all struggle with finding our identity in the midst of diminishment. And so in essence, that diminishment, though, you can turn it to become a superpower, so to speak. So yes, if we rewind the tape, I was serving in a 900-member congregation as a senior priest, and at that point, probably 6 years into the call, I roll into Cleveland Clinic for surgery on my spine. Was supposed to walk out, but something, in that time of surgery, a nerve was fried, and then I woke up post-op with an odd paralysis of the left side, and enough right leg that I can hop and drag, and so at that moment, going through rehab and then kind of coming to grips. I've always been an athlete, coupling my competitiveness with my faith and with my understanding that I began to then find how that my disability, after kind of going through the reality of, okay, this is it, I wheeled back into the parish, and the parish responded by putting ramps everywhere and putting handles on things. There was a handle on the altar, handle in the baptismal font. So it was. So I was able to weave in my new narrative. It really was, I could say, crappy. In the snow, and I had moments where, I could get angry. But the beauty of this was that all of a sudden I began seeing that my disability automatically began was woven into my identity as a priest, my identity as a member of a community, a child of God. So in the process of recognizing that fine, mobility was different. A wheelchair just gets you to point A to point B. I began, all of a sudden, my scales came off my eyes, because then I began to see my congregation and seeing the world when I would wheel into a Starbucks or going out, and I let the wheelchair be a conduit. So I did reimagine, because I think suffering, I learned in hospital and whatnot, suffering is relative. It's the meaning we give suffering. And I think suffering can be redemptive, can be something that can give birth to other possibilities. I began to see, people started coming to me and walls came down. I could wheel in to a room or wheel into a conversation. Less barriers were put up because people struggle with vulnerability and with shame and with a lot of those. So the disability becomes an opportunity to, in my ministry, my love for Christ, my deep love for being a priest and a servant of God, the chair became a tool, became a bridge. And so I used it in multiple ways. So anyways, I'll leave it. So in the process of living into this disability gave birth to an opportunity to reimagine it as a way to connect to some people's deepest struggles, their own disability. I began seeing people come to church because they hear, well, this priest who's in a wheelchair, just kind of this holy roller or whatever,
right.
you know. And I owned that moniker. I hung out at coffee shops, and I began. So I fast forward to St. Matthew's. That all of a sudden people would sit next to me and would start sharing their story. Because obviously my chair tells a story before I do. All of a sudden, it becomes an opportunity for me to tap into some people's deepest struggles, their shame, their right. fear of vulnerability. So that process of going through has just been living into the question of how each of our disabilities can become a gateway or an opportunity to listen more deeply to the other, and also for me to have the courage to tell my story as a way of liberating others. Anyways, and then in turn it liberates me. So there you have it.
So I thank you for all of that. I like how you're pointing out what I'm hearing a lot of you, a lot of what you're saying is focusing on language and how our own ability to kind of frame language also helps us to frame the situation that we're in. Specifically, you mentioned that we all have a disability. And so some people's may be more obvious than others, but, and I think the more we dive into the language that we use, again, you're talking about your disability being a conduit. You know, I think it's easy to dwell in negativity or to complain or to rethink, reimagine is some of the language you've used, how your situation can lead to opportunity. So I appreciate all of the language that you're giving to your own situation. It's very eye-opening to me.
Right.
So you've begun to kind of dive into this topic of how being a man with a disability has given you kind of a new, you said the scales came off your eyes, how it's given you a new perspective on life. And I'd like maybe just to ask you to dive a little bit more into that, how at that time of becoming a disabled man, and even continuing to now, how it's given you a new perspective on life, faith, ministry, everything.
Well, that's a heavy question to kind of.
I know,
but I mean, I'll get you a primer. Okay. My hope is you know. So yeah, no, it's a great question, you know, and so language, we throw language around so easily. I mean, when I say the word "shut in," homebound. We throw that, I mean, obviously as a clergy person and a member of congregation, how's that shut-in list, that homebound list? We have a tendency, I think, of using language as a way of identifying the other, one that is not us, right? So, you know, you mentioned the word ableism, or which comes from kind of that derogatory sense of oppression or a sense of
people
judgment.
People who have ability against people who lack some perceived ability.
We do that. We throw that around with ableism, racism, sexism, and ageism. Now, and then we go deeper, and then we can kind of parse out. You know, when I use what I recognized, you know, part of the scales falling off was when I say shut in, homebound. How do I experience that through the one who is the other, who is homebound and shut in? And my thinking is, it's easy then for us to disengage or disassociate when we put that label, even the word disability or disabled, or and of course I can say, yeah, I can embrace the chair and say, yeah, and for a lack of a better word, I'll say it sucks at times, and I can let that anger, but the anger doesn't define me. It says any of us who find out when we take off our glasses, it's a disability. It's something that, a diminishment of my ability to see across the room or to read the facial expressions. But obviously, it's not something that defines who we are. So the one thing about that in my faith and life, in that scales falling off, I began to see through new eyes or through a lens, right? Shut in, homebound. That was nails on a chalkboard to me because I have been doing that. I wasn't even aware. And then if Aunt Trudy or whether it's an older person or somebody who's disabled, no, I want to know Trudy, and she is as powerful a member of our community, even if she's absent. It showed to me what the priesthood, of all believers, and also the concept of the fact that you don't need to be proximate to be fully present, So in essence, I could find, I began changing my language of I don't want to just go and visit the shut-ins. I need to hear the story and the person. Then how do we then translate that? And when we gather as a sacramental community, that there is a whole community of people who aren't present, who we need to acknowledge and to name. So then I began, looking at the language we use. The story of my faith, it does come through being a priest, but how do we look at sacrament? How do we look at liturgy? How do we look at our architecture? So there are layers. I mean, you could look at it and say, how do you walk through your building? Accessibility is just, again, a word we throw around. Just because you put an elevator in and have a ramp from the parking lot into the building doesn't mean that you are a community that is radically inclusive, because you've got to go beyond the ramp. You got to go, just because you have an elevator and that's great. And we cut out some pews so that it reveals within me the question of my faith, my calling, and as a leader, being in a wheelchair makes me accountable. It's even having this conversation with you. I said, you asked, and I said, I've got to be, I got to find ways of giving voice that breaks down some of these walls and barriers. I would encourage, as a church, why don't you, your council, get in a wheelchair and roll around the building, or go to your quote shut-ins homebound, rename them as who they are, their identity in Christ and the name that they've been giving. Invite them to tell their stories. How have we as a community been accessible to you? How have we been a barrier to you? Because then you start peeling away and getting into their stories. Right. And a lot of times we can let language allow us to hide and not have to get ourselves involved. It's kind of like saying, how do you feel today? And you don't want, if that person comes and says, I'm having a horrible, will you sit down with me and hear my story? Now that's a whole other piece. So I think maybe would a segue into the story of the sacramental moment that I had at the table fit into this? So here's an example of that. The first Sunday coming out of rehab, and the first time I'm able to share the Eucharist with the community. We have 300 people in the sanctuary, and I've got these rails that I can pull myself up because I can stand for about 12 minutes or whatever. So I'm hanging on to the altar for dear life, which is one interesting.
That could be a whole sermon moment in itself.
So I'm standing up, and so I'm going into the liturgy. A wonderful book by Nancy Iceland called The Disabled God she tells the story, but this became so alive to me because I just heard the words until I experienced it. So I'm at the altar, going through the words of institution. I hold the bread up, and I hear "broken for you," and at the fraction in the Episcopal Church, when you break that bread, break the body at the altar, that sacramental moment, and when I pulled that bread apart, and I peered through the broken body of Christ. Because in Nancy Eisen's book, she talks about the fact that Jesus was raised with wounds intact. It didn't gloss over. In essence, the quote that God is so entwined with our disabilities and our brokenness. So anyways, the sacrament, and I look through the bread, and I see the faces of all the people I've known for, at that point, 6 years. And I've seen their hurts. I saw their disabilities. I mean, at that moment, there was a moment where the beginning of my journey and my own vulnerability and shame connected to all of theirs, their joys, their sorrows, their loss, their diminishment. And I began to see their disabilities and to see that we're like one big, beautiful, broken, was it Brennan Manning in his Ragamuffin Gospel, talks about. So that was a moment where the body of Christ, broken for you, the blood poured out for you, became so real. And it was a very intimate moment where I just almost ended up in tears, because that was a faith that took me deeper in my sacramental theology, understanding the depth of the cross and the depth of what the purpose of me being in a chair could be utilized as, and not an "oh, woe is me, poor little crippled priest." So anyways, that's probably more than you asked for. But
no, that's wonderful. I think I've been talking a lot about the gospel readings the past few Sundays. The idea of a suffering Messiah is something that the disciples couldn't really fathom. The idea that God was broken for humanity and suffered for humanity, and then, as you said, raised with wounds, was only able to be identified after rising again by the wounds. I love how you've been able to redefine your disability, if you will, has given you the ability to redefine so much about life and faith and how you view the world. Part of the goal with this Authentic Diversity campaign initiative that we've been doing is a lot about redefining and looking at the language that we use and how it hinders and limits us. And I hear a lot of that in the story that you've told today, is that the language that we use helps define how we view the world. So you mentioned homebound, shut in, and I've long had trouble with those titles too, because they limit, they hinder, or they identify someone by one small aspect of who they are, and they give too much weight, I think, and so thank you for all of that. I'd like to wrap up, Father Joe, with just kind of what you think might be helpful for others to know about that word. It's kind of a loaded word, ableism. It encompasses a lot. But what would be helpful for people to know about ableism and how it affects people with disabilities, and just how to move beyond maybe some of that clunky, limiting language that we all, as humans, fall into?
Well, that's a good question. I think the power of storytelling, the power of everybody called to be a holy listener, to be truly present with the other so that the other ceases to be the other, where and obviously disability is kind of a template, but you can apply it to anyone that society defines as the other, the outcast, the demoniacs, or how, we can have a tendency in our isms, to categorize people. So I think, disability is no different. I think it's a challenge, where to find out where your discomfort, where that edge of your discomfort is when it comes to somebody with a disability. And disabilities come in many shapes and sizes. And
you mentioned taking your glasses off, and that's something that so many people deal with, but they wouldn't think of it as a disability.
Go through your life without corrective lenses. That's where, if we could all see that we all have a disability. I mean,
a lack of ability of something.
Yeah, I think if we're dealing with a struggle of mental health, our understanding of our fears and anxieties, things that could become a prison or in our own mind, or a limiting bondage. I mean, that was a whole sin. Isn't sin like an ultimate disability, that ultimately we are, and we are saints and sinners simultaneously, which is kind of this Lutheran term, right? While you're saints and sinners simultaneous, you're realizing that, one, you are broken, and the theology of the cross, the understanding of the cross representing the fact that we are human, we are sinners. But the saint part is brought to us through the agency of Christ, and that God's love, completes us. So if we all recognize that we have no right to judge another person as less than, or even to look at somebody in a wheelchair, number one, they don't need your pity or the sense of, or we can always pick up, well, thank God it's not me. It could be worse. I could, what is that whole,
I know.
Met somebody, complained I didn't have any shoes until I met somebody who didn't have any feet. I mean, we can fall into that
fatalistic language that isn't helpful to the other.
I think so. How do you find the ability in the other? I led or helped lead a pilot program with Alpha, and they work with the developmentally disabled or developmentally challenged young people and adults, on helping them reorient into a job situation. We see them, whether it's somebody with Down syndrome or somebody who just deals with whatever that disability is. Maybe another word is diverse ability. I mean, think of our language, but when I sat with this group of people, amazing, just in their stories, we began to look at, how could we connect them to something better, bigger than they are, that they are so much more than what the world would define them as, or what bullies would call them. And so we began looking at superheroes. And they all got that concept of Spider-Man or Superman. And they were all of them were kind of ordinary, plain people, like Clark Kent, or but somehow are imbued with a superhuman ability, some superpower. So we went, and each person around that table, we tried to tease out, what's your superpower? And one of them, one young man said, he was all into Bob Ross and trees, and so his superpower was painting. I don't know. So we ended up finding new languages for them to discover that they are so much bigger than the world would define them as. I don't know. So you put that in the context of how we treat each other and see each other as the other. Heck, in the congregation, look at how people don't get along, and we're easy to judge the other person, whether you like them or don't like them because of a personality quirk or something. The key is if there was a way that if we can define them as brother or sister or sibling, see them as somebody created in the image of God. So maybe the last thing maybe I could say in that regard would be, if we encountered every single human being as somebody created in the image of God, but the image of God is in there somewhere, even if it's altered. But if we can connect to that, that's if we can listen to their story, we'll find God and find Christ in them. Kind of like that in Les Miserables when the bishop encounters Jean Valjean, and Jean Valjean's been told countless, he's worthless, he's nothing, he's in prison, he's a felon, and all he needed to hear was, "You're my brother." You know, it doesn't matter what the world defines you, but I define you as my brother. You belong. You are welcome. So I think it's the language we use. I love you. I forgive you. I think that's the whole part of the message of the gospel is changing the language from hate and judgment and otherness and make that. So anyway, so that's what the disability world. And I don't know, you have to find words for lack of a better purpose, but I think you just need to know that word is connected to a human being who has a story and who's a child of God. So, and each individual encounter is different. I think the image is when you encounter somebody that you would define as otherly abled, then if an opportunity arises, sit down, look them in the eye, don't look down on them, sit with them and ask their name. Ask, where, you find better questions like, what is your, with the kids, we were what's your favorite food? We'll talk about some in common that begins a conversation, that starts a friendship, and then eventually they'll tell you their
you're talking about
dreams.
Finding a commonality.
I think so, and I think we have to do that more. Churches can be notoriously segregated in more ways than one. But maybe just if people living with disabilities can be the greatest teacher in a congregation, then maybe your shut-ins and your homebounds that you rename as sister, brother, sibling. So anyway, so that's probably, am I hitting your question?
Yes, it is. Father Joesph, I think we'll conclude with that. This has been wonderful. So I want to thank you for your time and insight and the way you've helped me, and I think all of us, redefine a lot of language that needs to be redefined. So thank you.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Amen.